All right, we're live now. Hello, everyone. This is Ranjit Anapu, co-founder of Be Wastewise. I'll start with, we have all our panelists online, and I'll start with a little housekeeping. The Google Plus Hangouts is still a new technology, and there might be some technical glitches. So we request you to be patient with us. And the panel is live now, and to interact with the panelists and to comment, you can go to our website, wastewise.be, and use the live chat window there. Or you can also tweet at BeWastewise, or you can use the hashtags food waste and 2014 GDW. GDW stands for the Global Dialogue on Waste. The full video of this panel discussion will be available as soon as the broadcast is over, and excerpts from the video will be available soon. Now, coming to the panelists, we have Mr. Phillip Ward here with us. He is currently the chair of Resource Futures, and he was a former director of WRAP. For people outside UK, WRAP is WRAP. And we also have Mr. Jonathan Bloom here. He's the author of the book American Wasteland, and it was very helpful in bringing the topic of waste and food waste into mainstream media. And we also have Mr. Dean Pearce with us. He is the commercial manager of ReFood UK. ReFood UK is a waste services company which recycles food waste into fertilizer and energy. We also have Julia Hales with us. She is an independent consultant and describes herself as wearing many green hats. I'll let her talk about that. So to start with, Mr. Phillip, do you want to go with your introduction and a point, any point that you want to make about behavior change in food waste?
Okay, well, I'm happy to kick it off. I think the first thing to say is that this whole subject of food waste is incredibly complex, and I always hesitate to call myself an expert. This is a subject which is vast. It goes very deeply into the whole of our economic structures. So I can only throw a little light on one part of it, and I guess I got into this particular part because when I was a director at WRAP, we were given the task by the government of trying to understand why so much food was being wasted and developing programs which would help people, first of all, not to waste food, and then secondly, to come up with a better, more environmentally sustainable way of dealing with waste food, which did arise in the end. So we spent a lot of time and we did a lot of research, and I think the first thing I would say, the first point I make to anybody who wants to talk about food waste is you really have to understand not just what the aggregate totals are. You need to understand in great detail what sort of food is being wasted, what circumstances lead to it being wasted, and the sorts of behaviours which need to be addressed in order to change and reduce the amount of waste. It's a very specific, it's very scientific, and there are no shortcuts. Everybody knows it's wrong to waste food, but just telling people don't waste it, it's the wrong thing to do, is not the way forward. In fact, if you ask most people, they will tell you they don't actually waste food at all. That's somebody else who does that. We don't waste food. So understanding in great detail what's being wasted and why, and then coming up with solutions has to be the starting point.
All right, Mr. Dean, do you want to go now?
Yes, I'm a regional commercial manager for ReFood UK. We are an anaerobic digestion integrated into a great collection and recycling. So having some insight into selling solutions to people gives you great insight into behaviour. But I also manage the publication of Vision 2020, a roadmap zero food waste to landfill, which was a document that we did in conjunction with an organisation called Bioregional, published towards the end of last year, which really looked at the complete supply chain in the UK, looked at the sorts of numbers that were out there, and some of the solutions for food waste, essentially, raising some of very good case studies and some some of the issues, some of the barriers, and where it's changing, because there is a great deal of work that's being done and a great deal of improvements and steps forward that are being made. So very much like Philip, you know, I would also say that I'm no expert, but I have some insight, and I'm more than happy to share what I do know.
All right, Mr. Bloom.
Well, I think you all are being way too bashful. Of course we're all experts. That's why we're on here, right?
Yes, I thought we were inviting experts.
No. Just joking. I'm a journalist and a consultant and speaker on the topic of food waste. And rather than say I'm a food waste expert, I'll just say I know a thing or two about the topic. But most of what I focus on these days is awareness raising and shedding light on the topic of food waste. And here in the States, the real issue is getting people to think about food waste and to notice it as a problem. I've seen a lot more action and attention on the topic in the UK and elsewhere, in the EU especially. But here in the US, the real challenge is getting people to see the problem and then to try to do something about it. And we don't tend to want to act, or we can't change our behaviors if we don't see that we're doing anything wrong. So I focus these days on trying to do just that.
That's interesting, given that Mr. Phillip says no one thinks they're doing the wrong thing and the other one is doing. So that's really interesting. We'll get back to that. And Julia Hales, would you like to go?
Yep, thank you. Essentially, I cover a range of environmental issues and look at the impacts, and clearly waste in all the sectors is a real problem. But in food waste, it's something that, as the other panelists have said, that so many people are completely unaware, oblivious to the fact that they are creating a significant amount of food waste. And I think one of the things that I find really interesting is looking at it in terms of the different sectors, because we do it in terms of our household management, in terms of sort of not doing, if you like, a shopping list and sticking to that and thinking about when we're going to use food and how we're going to store it. One of the things is very simply look at if you're going to buy bread, for example, storing it in the freezer rather than letting it go mouldy in your bread bin and then just buying more of it. So there are lots of individual habits that we get into that are really causing a problem. But I think that what's interesting is going into some of the other sectors. For example, if you go to restaurants, the fact that many of the systems in restaurants actually result in a huge amount of food waste. And some of it's down to regulation, hygiene regulations, which are, in my view, quite over the top in some cases, where you can just never ever use anything again. I've recently been to India, and I was rather fascinated because when we were given our packed lunches at the end, the stuff that we couldn't eat, we were actually able to give away, and people were quite pleased to have it. Whereas in the UK, it's completely impossible to give away any type of food waste that you don't want. It's just tucked away en masse. If you go into the supermarkets and one tangerine is bad in a bag, the whole bag is thrown away. If you're in America, the size of the portions that you're given are absolutely monstrous, so they never actually check how much you really want to eat. So to offer people smaller portions, aeroplane food, if you want one thing from your little tray, all the rest is just tipped into the bin. And there's so many systems that mean that food waste is just sort of an inevitable result, and people are simply just entrenched in those systems without thinking about different ways around it.
That's very interesting. I think all of you are kind of pointing to one question, the first question that I was going to ask, and that was about the conflicting priorities that we have in our lives. I mean, coming to the public, Philip Watt was saying no one thinks that they're doing wrong, and they know wasting food is wrong. But that's not well. Okay, let's put it this way. I'll just read the question that Max and Perella structured for this panel. That is, the wish to avoid wasting money or good food may be overshadowed by desire for convenience because we lead busy lives. So we might have good intentions, but we fail to act on them. Are we mentally capable of prioritizing concerns such as food waste when confronted with immediate life challenges? I mean, can we actually have something like food waste, enter our daily lives as a thing that you should be prioritizing? Who wants to go first? Philip?
Well, I could make a point on that. Is that I think that one of the real challenges is actually getting food retailers to make it very difficult for people to waste the food that they buy. And at the moment, it's just a question of sort of selling what they can to the consumer. But there's very little advice on how to store food, how to make sure that you use what you buy, and really following through responsibility for the food right the way through the chain. Once it's left the retailer, they sort of they sort of left their responsibility behind, and I think they should be much more engaged in preventing waste in households.
That's interesting.
I think it's important to also just to frame the situation. In the UK, in households, it's estimated we produce about 7 million tonnes of food waste a year. The headline figure is very significant, but actually, on a weekly basis, in the 26 million, I think it is, households in the UK, the relative volume of food waste may not actually be that significant. Part of the problem is that food waste is generated in a very large number of locations in relatively small volumes, but the overall huge effect of that is a very significant food waste on an annual basis. And so, in many respects, actually, some of the steps that are required are relatively small. And I think, from my perspective, I think there is now a much greater disconnect generally between people and food. Not food waste necessarily, but food. People don't understand all of the nature of food, how it's produced, the costs that are involved. And then at the back end, probably the biggest issue is that we have, by and large, certainly in the UK still, a large propensity to use the general waste bin. And as soon as it's out of sight and out of mind, people lose perspective of how much food waste might be being generated. And so Philip's point right at the beginning, that actually when you ask people how much food waste they generate, they genuinely don't know. I've been to top hotels where they tell me they don't generate any food. And then actually when you drill down into it, they tell you, oh yeah, we go through 15 boxes of oranges a day, and the fruit peel goes into the bin. So there's clearly a complete disconnect between often what people define as food waste. So they're not throwing away whole bits, but they might be throwing away peelings and things like that, and they won't consider that as food waste.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that point, I think that there's a problem when that food's already been paid for in, say, the hospitality industry, in restaurants or with caterers. They might not feel that loss as much, so the economic factor isn't really working toward awareness. But in households, it should be a real factor for people. The throwing away of food is just throwing away money, and so as Dean was saying, the real problem there is that we don't see the food once we get rid of it. It just tends to go away. Now, if you're composting, whether you're doing it in your backyard or at the curbside, I think there's an opportunity to actually see the aggregation of your waste and to see the impact. But I think we need to do a better job of letting people know that there is a real value to the food they're throwing out. And the retailers, I think, do share some of the blame for putting such an emphasis on the sale price, on what you could buy something for. And we are swayed by that. We as consumers, we all love to save $1 or £1 here or there, but we don't think about the cost of the food that we don't use. So the savings up front may be much smaller than the actual amount we lose when we don't use half of a product.
I think that's a very good point about the visibility. And when I was at RAP, we ran a composting program. We sold 2 million compost bins, and so I'm a great believer in that. But I think we've seen an even more dramatic effect because a lot of local authorities now in England are collecting food separately from other waste. And it's the process of separating the food out brings home to people how much they are in fact wasting. And there is, I think, some good anecdotal evidence anyway, that once people can see that they're wasting food, they are more ready to address the question of how to reduce that amount of waste. You actually see the food waste go down. And I think that's, so this visibility of the issue is very important. It's one of the reasons I'm less keen on food waste disposal units, which I know are big in the States. But it's a way of hiding, smuggling away, and hiding how much food is being thrown away, straight down the sink, nobody ever sees it again. And I've got other things against it too, but that's one of the reasons. It just doesn't, it stops it being visible.
That's right. I mean, one key point that came throughout this discussion is that it's not visible, that, the food waste is not visible. So how do people who are trying to communicate about food waste communicate about it in such a way that, it makes a connection with the personal lives of people, and it tells them in a way that, it's wrong. Well, wrong for what reason? And how do they communicate it to these people, and what does it mean to them?
Well, I mean, it's one of the things I was going to say was that it's very difficult communicating to the public about food waste because the issue is far wider than what happens just within their homes. And of course, one of the debates that's very intrinsically linked with the whole concept of food waste is the whole area of packaging. And what I find is that people are always, very concerned about the amount of packaging on food, and they forget that, of course, it's much more important to preserve the food than the amount of packaging that is used. And of course, once you get into those type of debates, it's actually really rather complicated working out which is the best way forward. So, for a very simple example, if you package 4, apples in a nice container, which means that when you take it home, the apples last longer and you're much less likely to waste them, rather than having loose in the shop where people poke and prod them and lots more are wasted. I think in Asda they did a study where they sold food loose without the packaging, and they found they increased food waste by 50% in store. And people simply don't understand that idea at all because they're simply looking at one stage, which is the stage, obviously, when they get the food home.
Well, with 2 points there, I agree in principle, but just to play devil's advocate and to show Philip's point that it is complicated, you mentioned the example of tangerines, the bag of tangerines, where if there's one bad one in that bag, then chances are they won't have a way to resell those tangerines, the ones that are good. And then also customization, being able to choose the right amount of a product. So I hear from a lot of people who live alone and they find that they can't buy the right size. They have to buy too much and they can't use it all before it goes bad. So in many ways, packaging can work from the other direction, can lead to more waste. But I do agree in principle, if you're trying to weigh packaging versus food waste, that we should try to prioritize reducing food waste.
Yeah, and it's very difficult because, of course, some food, like for example, if you're packaging a joint of meat, the impact of that joint of meat is just like hundreds of times more than the impact of the packaging, and therefore it's really worth making sure it is well packed and they really aren't wasted. Whereas in other things, maybe the equation is not quite so stark. So there's that concept, and obviously in individual things, how they package it, how much they lump together, all those things are rather complex decisions that they need to take account. And I think some things people forget when they're buying loose products, that they quite often are putting it in a bag themselves. So actually they're not reducing the packaging. They've still got the packaging, but they've got all the problems with the fact that there's wasting the stuff in store and picking out the best lot and leaving the rest. So I think that really is difficult, and I'm very struck by the fact that in many developing countries, apparently, there is much more food waste in the distribution system and much less in people's households, because the packaging is not so sophisticated and the distribution systems are not so good. But in people's households, they're obviously much more concerned to waste less food.
I think that's a question of possibly cheapness of food for most affluent societies. I think it was an issue that faked humble for those people in the UK who know that name from television. Was recently quoted in an article in The Guardian saying that, is cheap food really part of the problem? And I suspect that may well be the case, that it has been proportionally cheaper to buy food now than it was many years ago. I think one of the other complex issues with behaviour change is that we're not as good in the kitchen now as we used to be many years ago, and so classic sort of foods that we used to make, or certainly my mum used to make soups and stocks and stews and risottos and that sort of thing. Those are classic sort of foods that you can make using little bits and pieces that might otherwise go to waste if you don't know how to use them. Little bits of meat left in the pot goes into a risotto, no problem. Little scraps of vegetables and things like that goes into all of those things. And that's a skill, again, part of this disconnect from food that I think is a more recent trend has a significant part to play.
Actually, I think that raises rather an interesting debate. Oh, sorry, Philip, you go in.
Well, I was going to say the problem with identifying the fact that food is relatively cheap is it sort of pushes you down a track which says, well, the answer to this problem is making food expensive, and clearly that's a difficult policy proposition to sell to people. But I think Dean's other point is much more powerful, which is that we've lost a lot of our skills in terms of understanding both when food is good or not to eat and not good to eat. So we become very reliant on fairly arbitrary labels which are stuck on the food by the producers. Secondly, we don't actually have the ability to say, yes, I can incorporate this food. So maybe I've got some fruit that's a little bit bruised, a little bit past it. I don't necessarily want to eat that as a straight piece of fruit now, but I'm perfectly happy to put that into a smoothie or make it into some other product where I'm not concerned by what it looks like. These sorts of understandings about the possibilities that are available for food is one of the reasons why people are now sort of throwing stuff away, which in years, in other times and in other places, it wouldn't be thrown away. But I think this is something which is really hard to get a grip of, but it's the sort of thing where you can begin to change behaviours to make people aware of possibilities, and the Love Food Hate Waste campaign, which we've been running in the UK now quite successfully, is very much directed at trying to help people see the alternative things they can do with food if it's left over, or if they got a bit more than they needed when they went to the shop. What can I do with this little bit by adding it to something else and making another meal out of it? I think people are beginning to see those possibilities now.
What I was going to try and say about is about the scratch cooking and putting together all the ingredients. And it's a strange argument to come from me in some ways, because I do a lot of cooking in my house and I'm a great one for stock pots. But I do think it's quite interesting to actually look and see whether it really makes sense for people to do scratch cooking on a more scratch cooking rather than buying processed foods. Because if you think about companies buying a lot of the ingredients in bulk and using all of those ingredients, rather than each of us individually going to the shops and buying our carrots and then probably chopping too much off the end, shoving that in the bin, not effectively being very efficient with the ingredients that we have, and then of course individually cooking them, which is a slightly different argument, but putting them in our individual ovens as opposed to having them done in bulk. So I think that's one of the things that I think is quite interesting about this debate, is it's not always the most what seems to be the most obvious answer. It's not necessarily the one that reduces food waste best.
Well, that's a really interesting notion, and we could certainly explore that a bit, but you're assuming that the larger kitchens would be more efficient with those carrot ends, and hopefully they would be, but I'm not so sure that's what's happening in reality.
Economics that drive them, so they're going to be more keen to put all the ingredients in there than I mean, I've seen friends of mine, and it drives me mad, chopping up their leeks and only losing sort of, you know, chopping up huge bits and shoving it in the bin. That's partly what gave me that idea.
Yeah, right. But I would say that the cultural implications of cooking, getting closer to your food, are so valuable and so important to then reducing waste. The more we know our food, the less likely we are to waste. I would say it's worth losing a little bit here and there to make people do more cooking.
Get what you can from people. So it looks like there has been a suggestion to increase the number of cooking classes around the world. But coming back to, there are many people at different levels around the world trying to make some difference with communicating about food waste. To we can call them community influencers or people within organizations, which can actually have a direct impact on food waste. From you, with your experience in the US and UK, what kind of behavior change communications have generally worked? Or, I mean, where can these community influencers start learning about, behavior change communications? In US and UK, I'm sure there is no silver bullet, but, generally, where can they start? Anyone wants to take that?
Well, I think this goes back. Sorry, am I okay to cover? Sorry, Dean. Do you want to go in first?
Yes, no problem.
Go ahead, Dean. Sorry.
No. I was going to say, again from my experience, but probably Philip's got more direct experience of this. But I think gradual and slow ways, lots of things are happening. Certainly in the UK, it's probably the subject of food waste has never been more prominent, never been more discussed in general in the press with newspaper articles and industry information, etc. There has also been some beautiful legislative changes. The UK is made up of a number of countries, Ireland, in England, and in Wales they've taken an approach to food waste where they've effectively banned it from landfill. So that in itself sends a very clear signal, in my opinion, to the public about the value of food, that it shouldn't really be squandered in the sense of it being sent to landfill, and that there are better uses for that material. Likewise in Scotland, where actually that's been rolled out to businesses as well, which again sends another signal to businesses where they have to make food waste available for separate collection, which again leads to that potential for behaviour change where they're beginning to see the volume of food waste that's being generated. And to be honest, it's only once you start to see it that you can begin to manage it. You cannot manage what you do not measure, or cannot measure. If you chuck stuff in the general waste bin, you don't get told how much food waste is in there. You've got no chance whatsoever of trying to reduce it. You don't know what you're starting from.
I think sorry, I won't respond to that. I'll go back to the original question. I think the thing that we found when it came to communication to get people to change their behaviour takes me back to my original point. It's understanding what people are wasting and what circumstances they're wasting it in. For example, we know that the things that are wasted most are bakery products and fresh fruit and vegetables. So you need to address the question about why are those being wasted. and it could be about telling people, you know, it's a good idea to keep your bread in the freezer, or in the Julia made earlier. It's surprising how many people hadn't thought of that, who are used to keeping their bread so it's just lying around so it goes off. Secondly, telling people what they can do with stale bread. There's lots of stuff you can do with stale bread. With fruit and vegetables, we actually had to do some research to establish, because nobody seemed to know, what was the best way of storing fresh fruit and vegetables. And it turns out, much to everyone's surprise, it's keeping it in the fridge, but keeping it also wrapped in the fridge. So keeping it in a plastic bag for most fruit and vegetables is the best way forward. A lot of people didn't know that. Most people kept their fruit on a nice display in a bowl in the kitchen at room temperature, and it rotted very fast. So it's about helping people to understand, picking the areas where we know they're wasting food, and helping them to understand behaviours that can help them. The other big areas are to do with portioning. So we know that a lot of people, a lot of the food waste we find when we do the analysis is because people essentially have served up too much rice, too much pasta, too many potatoes. Helping them to develop techniques for measuring the amount of they need to cook and present in order to feed the family, again, is a very useful way forward. But these are things which you can't generalize. You actually have to look in detail at what the problem is, and what the behavior is that underlies the problem, and then you can come up with some sort of useful communication that people can relate to and will help them make better decisions.
That's interesting. Does anyone have contributions there?
I guess the logical question to that is then, how is it actually communicated to people, and how successful is that communication in creating behaviour change?
Right.
Because, I mean, certainly we know that Love Food, Hate Waste has been a very successful campaign.
That's right.
It's widely known, which is fantastic. But when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of households and how many people are actually actively making changes to the way they behave, I don't know what the stats are. I don't know, what the numbers are, and how effective that is or is not. And that's why I wonder whether, in terms of having legislative drivers that really send a very clear signal, whether that is also an important part. One of the other things that I wonder whether it's important as well is in terms of making things a little bit more mainstream. For example, where we're beginning to see celebrity chefs actually actively talking about food waste reduction and recipes involving types of foods that are quite common to go off quickly and things like that. And what I'd like to see is the use of things like kitchen caddies on television programmes, because you see these things, and I remember watching the Great British Bake Off in the UK, where this contestant ceremoniously poured some content of their thing into black lined, bin liner lined bin, which essentially just sends a very clear signal to the 6 million viewers that is a waste material destined for general waste. Actually, wouldn't it be very nice just to put it into a kitchen caddy that's got a recycling symbol on it or something that actually says, if you have a kitchen caddy at home or a service for separate collection of food waste, you can use it. and I think very simple things like that could have a very profound impact.
We actually have a comment on this discussion. The Twitter handle stop_food_waste says local interventions with small groups to enable peer-to-peer activities are more effective than mass communications. Any responses to that?
Well, one thing that I've seen, and I would say that in general, the States is far behind the UK in terms of campaigns, but there's a campaign that's built on the Love Food, Hate Waste idea, and it's derivative in a way, but it's Food Too Good to Waste is the name of it. And what they've done is they've hired a local chef to film these videos where where this woman will go into people's homes and do videos on how they can use those leftovers in those use-it-up meals, like the risotto that we heard from Dean, or a whole bunch of other ideas, talking about expiration dates and being a smarter shopper. And then there's on that web platform, there's a way for people to leave ideas for each other, and that kind of peer-to-peer sharing is certainly helpful, in addition to the offline kind of peer-to-peer interaction, where we've seen some campaigns here where neighbors have shared their garden excess. So if you have too much of one crop, if you have too many cucumbers, why don't you share that with your neighbor, or maybe trade, because chances are they might have something that they can't use.
I think it's really easy to focus on households, but I'd be quite interested to actually get the statistics of how much food is wasted in the food chain before it gets to households, because in my view that's a really important area. And when you see, you know, companies throwing masses of bananas into a great big pit because they're too ripe or whatever for the food chain, and the fact that the systems that we have are creating those type of food waste, I think it's really important to start looking at that too. And also an area where communication, I think, is absolutely vital is in restaurants. And obviously I've pointed out in the States about how the fact that we're given portions that are twice the size that anybody is able, well, most people should be able to eat. And I think that I think that we really need to target restaurants and have a look at what they're doing with their waste. I went to Yo Sushi and found that they were literally chucking huge amounts of stuff just straight into the bin, not to lovely, biogas or anything else, just in the bin with all the general waste. As soon, I think they had a sort of 3-hour date on it, limit on the food that goes round on those rings. As soon as it's finished, with all the other waste into the bin. And I think that we need to really highlight those cases and make it so that it really is an abomination for them to do that.
That's interesting. So, talking about the food waste of the supply chain, and slightly changing the discussion, we have a question: should producers and retailers be made more accountable with regards to the overselling or surplus creation of food products? And do voluntary agreements on waste prevention, example the UK's Court commitment, go far enough? And I know Phillip Ward was involved with the Court commitment. Do you have any comments on that, Phillip?
Well, I think the Court commitment was all about trying to get the major retailers to accept responsibility for the. It started mainly with packaging, but then brought in food waste later on. And the difficulty you always have with this is that you need to find a way, if you're not going to go through legislative routes, and this is just voluntary, you need to find the motivating factor, the thing that's going to make the retailer want to sell you less food. And it's initially sort of counterintuitive. Why would they want to do that? But actually, if you get them on a broader social responsibility agenda, where they're looking at longer-term relationships, market share, customer loyalty type of issues, and these are areas which we found that you can engage in. They can see the point of appearing to care about their customers and helping them to save money and not waste food. And I think that has been quite successful. And it's certainly not finished yet. I mean, it's a process which is ongoing, and you keep ramping up the targets and the objectives. But I mean, we think that within the UK, we've seen something like a 21% reduction in food waste, actually hitting the bin at the end of the consumer part of the story, anyway. But I think those agreements can do quite a lot, and it helps if you, rather than trying to mandate a particular way of behaving, you can engage their creativity and allow them to use the competitive pressures between them as retailers to find new ingenious solutions. But so I think you can get so far down that way. Just responding to Julia on the question of the food chain before you get to the retail part of it. Yeah, I think these are really, really important, complicated questions. But again, it's I go back to my basic point. You need to understand what is it that makes those sushi throw food away. Where did the 3-hour limit come from? Is it a safety thing? And what are the alternatives you can offer them at the end of that process? If I don't know how long wolves can go around before somebody starts worrying about whether it's still safe to eat or whether it's the question is, what are the alternatives? And you do need to work this through by engaging people and pointing out, yes, maybe you engage them by shaming them for having that system in place, but you still need to engage them with what are the alternatives and how can they address these questions.
That's interesting. We actually have only 3 minutes to go, the last 3 minutes. So you can actually have your final words for the panel discussion. And I would really like you to address those two people who are trying to make a difference with food waste, and how they can actually do that. So who wants to start first?
Well, I've just spoken, so somebody else.
Okay.
I'll start. I think that the consumer focused campaign, certainly in the UK, has been fantastic in terms of having an impact and raising awareness. But I think there's a lot more work to do in targeting retailers in several ways. One is in terms of the communication that they give to consumers about what to do with the food that they buy and how to minimize waste in your household, so that they too are working in that direction. Also in their own supply chains and in their own stores in terms of what they're doing and the systems they operate to minimize food waste there. And then you've got the other end of the chain, which we haven't really talked about, but the agricultural side and the selection of crops, where farmers are being told that a whole field of whatever crop it is that they're growing is the wrong size or the wrong type or has got the wrong sort of things in it. And I think that those are all things that need to be addressed, and actually I think retailers are often at the heart of many of the issues there, and we should be really tackling that.
From my perspective, I would urge governments and businesses to move away from general waste as much as humanly possible, to look at separate collections of the various waste streams and make food waste absolutely critical, if not central to that. I would argue that it's pivotal to reducing food waste, to better utilising food resources, whether that be unavoidable or avoidable food waste, and I think that in itself would lead to a very significant amount of behaviour change at consumer level, as well as obviously within the businesses. It sends also a very clear signal that food is a valuable resource, and we should not.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So building on that, I think there's a notion that food waste has no value, and that's because we call it waste. So shifting the semantics a bit, if we were to call it more of a resource than a waste product, that would get people to think about it differently, to try to turn toward composting or anaerobic digestion, and to be more careful with that food product, whether it's food that's still good or food that we won't be eating. But I try to give people 3 rationales on why they should not waste food, and sort of let them choose what works best for them, whether they're a family household shopper or whether they're running a business. But really it's the ethics, the environmentalism, or the economics. And you could make a compelling argument in all 3 cases, and there's really no reason why we should be wasting as much food as we are. And so with a little more awareness raising, combined possibly with some legislative action such as landfill bans, to prod those who don't necessarily go for the voluntary environmentalism, I think we'll make progress sooner rather than later.
Sounds good. So we're already 1 minute over the time, so I'll end it here. And first of all, thank you very much for coming in and joining us. And we know that it's a very complex issue and cannot be discussed comprehensively in 45 minutes. So we have 3 more panels on food waste coming up this year, and we are trying to do more about bringing experts to talk about food waste. And also, while you were talking, I just wanted to share an experience that I have. I'm an Indian, and whenever I eat my food, and when I'm trying to clean my plate, and if there are any rice grains on it, and my father accidentally sees that, he says, when you're throwing away that rice grain, think about the farmer and how many months he actually, spent to make that rice grain, and think about all the distance it traveled to come to your home, to be stored and come to your home, and you're just like throwing it away without actually eating it. I mean, the purpose of food is to be eaten. So yeah, with that, I think we can end this talk. Thank you again. Thank you very much. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. And thanks for sharing that info.
Sure.
Okay, bye everyone.
All right. Bye.
Right. Keep it up.